We're going to look at how you find the amplitude, period, frequency, and midline for sine and cosine graphs. Now, before we start looking at the actual graphs, I need you to know a couple of things about sine and cosine. So your sine graph looks just in general like this, where it's got these three middle points. Notice we start in the middle, then we go up to the top, then go down to the middle, down to the bottom, back up to the middle. Okay? Or you can think that you go middle, top, middle, bottom, middle. Okay? This is your positive sine graph. And remember that sine and cosine are both cyclical, so this continues on in that same pattern, right, forever, and in the same direction, or it continues on to the left as well, this way. Right, so this right here that I've shown is just one period of the sine, or how long it takes to complete one cycle or one wavelength before it starts to repeat. Okay, if we look at a negative sine graph, you have that it starts in the middle, goes to the bottom, then to the middle, then to the top, then to the middle. So just like our other graphs that we've looked at, it reflects it across the x-axis. So that is our negative sine graph, or it goes middle, bottom, middle, top, middle. Now our cosine graph that we have, your cosine graph, instead of starting at the middle, it starts at the top. It goes top, middle, bottom, middle, top. So cosine graph, I didn't draw it superbly well, but it looks kind of like a smiley face. Okay. Your negative cosine graph will start at the bottom, go to the middle, go to the top, go to the middle, go to the bottom. So it kind of resembles a frowny face. So I use that to help me remember positive cosine. It's like a smile because you're positive when you have a smile, or that your negative cosine is a frowny face because you're usually negative when you have a frowny face. Okay. For the sign to remember between positive and negative, the positive sign goes up first and the negative sign goes down first. Okay. Now notice on the sine wave that you get you get your smiley face. Okay, try again. Your frowny face and your smiley face in both of them. Okay. So that's how I like to remember sine and cosine. So when we look here to find the period, when we're talking about one period for sine, we're looking at three middles. When we're looking at the period for cosine, notice it goes from top to top, or that it goes from bottom to bottom. Okay. So that's how we're going to utilize that when we look at the period in just a few minutes. Now, the first thing that we're going to look at is where our maximum and minimums are. So this is our highest value. This is our lowest value. So our max is at 2. And then our minimum is at -4. Okay? So what we can do with that is we can find our amplitude. Remember that the amplitude is how far it goes from the middle to the top or the middle to the bottom. Okay, so this part is our amplitude. Okay, so what we can do to find the amplitude is that you can always do your max minus your min cut in half, and that will give you your amplitude. So in this case, we're going to do 2 minus a -4 cut in half. Now, if you go to put this in your calculator, make sure that you use parentheses here. Otherwise, you're just saying take this part here to divide by 2, and really we want the whole thing divided by 2. Or you can just do it with your brain. So you've got 2 minus a minus, which turns to plus. So 2 plus 4 gives us 6, cut in half, which gives us 3. So the amplitude is 3. Now, for the midline is the middle line, right? Now, some of you will be able to just visually tell where your midline is located. Okay. Some of you will not be able to do that, so you can find it using arithmetic as well. So if we want to find the midline, your midline can be found a couple of ways. So you can do your max minus the amplitude, or you can do your min plus the amplitude. Okay. So if we look at that here, if we do our max, that's 2, minus the amplitude, which we found is 3, which gives us a -1. Or we could have done -4 plus the amplitude, which is 3, which gives us -1. Now, either way, when we're talking about the midline, we want to write equals y because that gives us the equation for this green line that we have. Okay, so our midline has to be written as an equation. Y equals some number. Notice that's the equation of that line that's green. Then we have, how do we find the period? Again, the period is how long it takes to do one cycle. So in this case, I want to start looking at 0. Okay, so at 0, if we look at 0, notice that I'm starting at the top, which means I know that this is a cosine graph. Now, technically cosine and sine graphs are just shifts of each other, so we could write it as a sine or a cosine graph. Like, for example, if I started from here, this would be a sine wave, right? Or if I started from here, I could have it as a negative cosine, right? So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can write the equation. But in general, it's nice to just start with looking at what happens at 0. At 0, if it's at the top, the bottom, or the middle, you can write it as a sine or a cosine graph. Equation rather. So when we have it's at the top, I want to look at how far it takes before we get to the next top, because again, our cosine graph goes from top to top. So I'm going to look here, and we're going from top to top. That's one period or cycle or wavelength. In math, we usually refer to it as period. In science, they usually refer to it as wavelength. Okay, that's one wave and how long that wave is. Okay, now we can tell here that this stops right here at pi halves. So the period is pi halves. Now sometimes it doesn't stop at a nice mark on the graph and you can't tell exactly what it is. So there is a second way that you can get it. I'm going to show you that second way now. So you can also count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi, and that will help you determine how long the period is. So if we look here, here's a second cycle. If we look at this, is a third cycle. So we're counting how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So I'm not quite done yet. And here is the fourth cycle, and then this is where 2 pi is, so I'm all done. So I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 different cycles that happen between 0 and 2 pi, right? So we can find the period by doing 2 pi divided by the number of cycles that are between 0 and 2 pi. So that gives us 2 pi over 4, which gives us pi halves, which notice matched the period that we got earlier. Okay. Now we refer to this number, the number of cycles, is b. So b is the number of cycles between 0 and 2 pi. Okay. So then remember that way that we find the frequency, it's just the reciprocal of the period. So if our period's pi halves, then the frequency is just 2 over pi, making sure that your pi is in the denominator. Okay. If we take a look at the next one, we can have our max and min again. So our maximum is here, our minimum is here, and then we can use that max and min to find our amplitude. So our max is at 5, the minimum is at 1. You also want to be checking your scale on your y-axis to make sure that you can, or that it's going by ones or what it is going by, so that you can properly get your mins and your maxes. So then your amplitude is going to be your max, which is 5, minus your min, which is 1, cut in half. So we do 5 minus 1, which is 4, cut in half. Now, you could also visually do this on your graph. You could go 1, 2, 3, 4. We've gone up by 4, and then cut that amount in half. Okay, that's another way that you could get the amplitude. So either way, our amplitude is 2. Now, we can also find the midline. Again, some of you will be able to see the midline without doing any math. If you need to do the math, that's fine. Again, you can do your max, so your 5 minus your amplitude, which is 2, or you could do your min plus your amplitude, but either way we get 3. Remember, we're writing the equation as, or the midline as an equation. Notice that I also am marking what my answers are. So when you're writing answers down, you need to know that you need to label the amplitude as one thing, the midline is another thing, right? So that it's obvious that you know which piece goes with what. Okay? So now I always like to do a quick check on the midline and make sure my midline makes sense. So notice here, if I look at 3, my midline makes sense. The other way you could visually do your counting again, if you know your amplitude is 2, you can start from the bottom and count up by 2, or start from the top and count down by 2 and get to your midline. That's another way that you could do that. Okay? So now we're going to look at how long the period is, or the wavelength, or the cycle. Okay, so when we look at this one, at 0, I'm starting in the middle. That means that it's a sine graph, which means I want to look for 3 middles. So here's one middle, here's my next middle, here's my next middle. So this right here is the wavelength, or the period, okay, or the cycle. Okay. So that means that the period is 4 pi. Now, I'm going to connect something to what we just had talked about. We had talked about how you can count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi, and that will be your b value, and you can use that to find the period. Now notice here, if I count how much of a cycle happens between 0 and 2 pi, that we don't even get a full cycle. I've only got part of a cycle. I've only got 2 middles, right? Or that I'm halfway between the graph, right? So my b value would be a half, so if I want to find the period would be 2 pi divided by a half. Remember, you have to flip and multiply, so I'm going to times by 2 over 1. And then that gives us 4 pi over 1, which is just 4 pi, which notice is the exact same answer that we got here. Okay, so I just want to connect that the two of those still work. The way with when the cycle is longer than 2 pi, when I haven't gone a full cycle, by 2 pi, I like to just see how long the cycle has taken. So here, I just like to look, oh, not that color. I just like to look and see this right here is how long it took to do one cycle, right? And then I just figure out what that length is. Okay? If there's more than one cycle between 0 and 2 pi, then I like to count how many cycles happen. If we take a look at the next example, okay. So again, we want to look at our maximum and our minimum. Okay? So then to find the amplitude, we can do max minus min cut in half. So we would do 7 minus 3 cut in half. So that gives us 4 halves, which just gives us 2. So our amplitude is 2. Again, you could visually count 1, 2, 3, 4, and then cut that amount in half, which is 2. Okay? Again, some of you will be able to just see where the midline is. If you can, that's great. Don't forget when you write the midline that you need y equals. Okay? You can also do your math to figure out where it is, or you can visually count again. So we would do the max, which is 7, minus the amplitude, which is 2, so that gives us 5. Or we would do the minimum, which is 3, plus the amplitude, and which is 2. And then that gives us 5. And I'm missing the equals y, so don't forget the equals y part. Okay, so that, the midline, is this one right here. Okay, now again, you could also utilize the fact that we go from the bottom up 2, or from the top and go down 2, and then get to your middle. That's another way that you could do it. Now, if we look here, if I start looking at what options where we're starting at 0, so at 0, we're in the middle. That means that it's going to be sine, so I want to look for 3 middles. So here, this is one wavelength. Oops. This right here is our wavelength, or our cycle, or the period. Okay. Now, this happens to end at a nice spot, right? It ends here at pi, so it's easier to tell what the period is. Okay. Now, if I can't tell from there, I can again still count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So notice that when we're counting with sine that our middles overlap. So this middle counted on the last one, but it also counts on the green one. So we have 2 cycles. Now notice this is 2 pi, so we have 1 cycle, 2 cycles. So that means that our b is 2. So then the period would be 2 pi divided by b. Well, the b is 2. So then the period would be pi, which notice is the same thing that we got before. Okay. So either one of those is fine. Then make sure that you do the frequency. The frequency is the reciprocal of the period, which is 1 over pi. I think I neglected the frequency on the last one. I did. So the frequency here was, the period was 4 pi, so then the frequency would be 1 over 4 pi. Make sure when you're writing this that you don't write 1/4 pi. That's not the same thing. Okay. This would be equivalent, the wrong one would be equivalent to pi fourths, right, which is not the same thing. So make sure that you're careful in that. Okay, so for the next 3, I'm just going to look at the period and frequency because that's usually where the struggle is. So on this one, notice at 0 we're starting at the top, which means that it's a cosine. So I want to go from top to top, and that will be 1 cycle. So here, this is the 1 cycle. So this here is our wavelength, or the period, or the cycle. Okay. So the period here is 6 pi. Now notice, if I were to count how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi, if I count here, I've only gone this portion of the graph, right? I haven't even gone a full amount. And this one's a little bit harder to tell on what portion of the graph that you've gone. I'm going to tell you it's a third of the way. Okay? So you can connect how the b matches to get to the period. So if we know that the b is 1/3, if I find the period by doing 2 pi divided by b, it's going to be 2 pi divided by 1/3. That means I'm going to flip and multiply, so we times by 3 over 1, so that gives us 6 pi. All right. So the period is 6 pi, which notice is the same as what we got here. Again, when the period goes past 2 pi, I like to see just how long it is. Okay. Now notice on all of these graphs, we have some amounts before and after, right? Like I've got this amount here that was before and this amount that's after, right? Or this amount that's before, this amount that's after. But I'm only counting for the b values between 0 and 2 pi. So please make sure that you're paying attention to that detail. Okay. If we look at this example, again, I'm just doing the period and the frequency. Did I remember the frequency on the last one? I did not. Let's do the frequency. The frequency is going to be the reciprocal of the period. The period is 6 pi, so that means that the frequency is 1 over 6 pi. Again, make sure that your pi is in the denominator. It was in the top for the 6 pi, so that means that when you flip it, that it has to go to the bottom. Okay, back to this one. So I'm going to start counting my cycles. On this one, I start at the bottom. So that means that it's a cosine. It's a negative cosine. So I'm going to go from bottom to bottom. So if I look here, I'm going from bottom to bottom. Now, if I measure, we've got this amount like right here. So this is our wavelength, or the period, or the cycle. Okay, but I can't tell exactly what that is. I mean, I could estimate because I know it's between pi halves and pi, and I also know it's between pi halves and 3 pi fourths, so it's smaller than 3 pi fourths, but it's more than a half, and then past that I would just be guesstimating. But we can find the precise amount by counting how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So if we count again this cycle from bottom to bottom, notice I need to keep counting because I haven't made it all the way to 2 pi. So I'm going to keep counting here. So then that means I've got 1, 2, 3 cycles. So that means that the b is 3. So that means that the period is going to be 2 pi thirds. So this value right here is at 2 pi thirds, right? Which visually makes sense. If I take pi and I cut it into 3 pieces, it's going to be 2 of those pieces, right? 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, it's 2 of those thirds. Okay. Now the frequency is going to be the reciprocal. The reciprocal means that you're flipping. So the 3 goes on top and the 2 and the pi go on the bottom. Okay. Last example. Okay, again, I'm going to start counting from 0. At 0, we're at the bottom. So that means that I want to go to the bottom, the next one. Again, this is in between, so I'm not sure. I know it's less than pi halves. I also know it's more than pi fourths, but I would be estimating. It looks like it's a little bit past halfway, but we can find the precise amount by just counting how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So there's our first one. Here's our second one. Here's our third one. Here's our fourth one. I'm still counting because I haven't made it to 2 pi yet. And then here's a fifth one. And then now I've made it to 2 pi. Again, we're only counting between 0 and 2 pi. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that means that our b value is 5. So that means to find the period, we're going to be doing 2 pi divided by b. The b is how many cycles happen between 0 and 2 pi. So notice even though I've got this portion, and I should do a different color, and this portion here, right? I'm only carrying about this part from 0 to 2 pi. Okay, that's where we can locate our b value. Okay, so then since our b value is 5, we get 2 pi fifths. Notice I look to see I can't reduce 2 pi fifths, so that's the final answer for the period. The frequency is the reciprocal. So the reciprocal you're going to flip. So we get 5 over 2 pi, making sure the pi is in the bottom. So that is how you can find your characteristics from your graph for sine and cosine.